So the 2024 NFL and college football season is fully underway, which means the 2025 NFL draft really isn't that far away at this point. So today we're going to do the very first mock draft of the 2025 NFL draft cycle. As you guys know, I work for the Hula Bowl as a scout, which means I have access to tape on every single one of these guys. And I've watched pretty much most of the first round guys. So my rankings are going to be a lot different than what the general rankings are out there. In my opinion, a lot of the rankings are just copy and paste, right? You get the official rankings from ESPN. That's pretty much what most people follow, but I don't take that same approach. I go based off the guys that I've actually watched. You know, an example is Mason Graham, who you guys see on the screen. I think he's probably the most overrated player in this class. At least early on in the process, that could change down the line, but his tape's really not that impressive to me. But let's get into it, man. I'm excited for this one. Now, I obviously did not pick this draft order. This is actually based off of Super Bowl odds. But the Carolina Panthers did move off of their quarterback in Bryce Young, which means that they might be actually in the market for a quarterback. Now, some people will disagree with me when I say this. I don't think the Carolina Panthers are actually going to take a quarterback. Even if they have the number one overall pick, to me, it just doesn't make sense for the Panthers to take a quarterback at this point. If you're going to say Bryce Young failed because of reasons X, Y, and Z, there's no reason why the next quarterback won't also fail for those same reasons. At the same time, Matt Canales hasn't really proven himself as a coach that can win in the NFL. And I know at this point he'll have Andy Dalton going up against the Raiders in this very first game. It's a game that they're probably going to lose. Let's just be honest. The Raiders are a much better team, in my opinion, than the Panthers, which also makes me believe the Panthers would be smart to trade out of that pick. And I think there's a team that needs a quarterback, and if they get a quarterback, they're actually going to be able to actually have success as a team, and that's going to be the New York Giants. I think the Giants have a pretty solid roster. They have a good wide receiver in Malik Neighbors. They have a pretty good offensive line with Andrew Thomas, and now at right tackle they have Jermaine Illuminor. On the defensive side, they have probably the most disruptive defensive tackle in the NFL in Dexter Lawrence. I think it makes sense for the Giants to trade up with the Panthers. I'm not a trade draft expert, so I don't know exactly what it's going to end up being. We're going to just force this trade. But I think the Giants do trade up, and I think the Giants trade up specifically for a quarterback. Now, my rankings on a quarterback is going to be different than the general ranking. Some people think it's Carson Beck that'll be the number one overall pick. Some people say Shedeur Sanders. I do like Sanders a lot, but I actually think Miller Moss is the number one quarterback in this class. If there's one thing Lincoln Riley has taught me, it's that this guy knows what he's doing with quarterbacks. And Miller Moss ultimately may not come out of the actual NFL draft process, but based off of what I've seen over his first few games, based off of what I saw last year in that bowl game, Miller Moss is a phenomenal quarterback, man. I know he's a little inexperienced, but keep in mind, we got like 10 more games with Miller Moss. And we got a big one in USC versus Michigan, but I think Miller Moss is going to end up being the first quarterback taken when that time actually comes. I think the New York Giants would actually be smart to take Miller Moss. I think it just makes a ton of sense. Then at number 2, you got the New England Patriots. I was tempted with the New England Patriots to take a defensive end. I think there's certain positions you take if you're a top 5 pick, right? You're not going to take a safety in the top 5. You're not going to take a running back in the top 5. Edge defender is a position you would take, but with Keion White absolutely dominating the past couple of weeks, I felt like it doesn't really make sense for the Patriots to more investments into that defensive line. You have Christian Barmore, you have Keion White, Jennings has looked pretty good as well. And then generally speaking, the defense is pretty solid as well. And you could consider a corner, which I would, but I think it makes more sense for the New England Patriots to get a wide receiver. Jalen Polk has looked really, really good, right? The guy's looked good, at least for a rookie early on. But I think adding the best wide receiver in this class actually benefits the New England Patriots because you're essentially getting your future franchise quarterback a potential option, right? Drake May needs wide receivers to be able to get the ball out to, and I think a lot of people will take Travis Hunter as the number one wide receiver. I personally don't. Again, I know people are going to disagree with it. I think Luther Burden's the best wide receiver in this class out of Missouri. I like Tatorio McMillan as well out of Arizona, right? 6'5", 220 pounds, massive human, can move. But Luther Burden's is different, man. The way this guy is able to run routes, the way this guy makes plays with the ball in his hands, to me, he's the best wide receiver in this class. Some people will also argue for Travis Hunter, but I'm not 100% sure if I agree that Travis Hunter's the best wide receiver in this class. And the thing is if Travis Hunter, if he played wide receiver full time, maybe he can prove that. But at this point, I'm just not 100% sure if I agree with that. To me, what I've seen from Burden, he's an absolute superstar caliber player. The Denver Broncos are in an interesting position as well because they got a quarterback. They could also use a wide receiver, but they could also use a corner, maybe a D tackle, maybe an offensive tackle. Although I do like what the Denver Broncos have kind of invested on the offensive line. Right guard, one of the best right guards in the NFL, and Quinn Menez, phenomenal player, right? I think the Denver Broncos could go defensive back, right? Maybe you take Will Johnson, maybe Travis Hunter. To me, I think for the Denver Broncos, the best thing they can do with this pick is focus in the trenches, right? And I think on the defensive side, it's going to make the most sense for them. Now, they could take an interior defensive tackle, but I personally just don't think any of these guys are worth the third overall pick. But I do think defensive end, James Pierce Jr. is the best defensive end right now in the class. And I think Pierce is different than some of these other guys. Mikael Williams hasn't proven himself yet. Nick Scorton kind of reminds me of Cleveland Burrow. I'm not too high on him. But James Pierce, man, the guy moves absolutely different. Kind of reminds me of Will Anderson Jr. a little bit. Although he's not as fine-tuned as Will Anderson, I don't think he's that far behind Anderson either. So I'm going to take James Pierce. I think the guy's a very, very good football player. The Titans also drafted a quarterback recently. The Titans are an interesting spot as well because I don't think they're going to have the fourth overall pick. But if they were to me, I think corner is a position they could potentially target, although they do have some good players on that side of the football. Maybe you go defensive line. Titans do have some good defensive linemen, right? You got Harold Landry, Arden Key, right? You got some good defensive ends already kind of there. You got one of the best D tackles in Jeffrey Simmons. I think corner makes sense for the Titans, and I think Will Johnson's the best corner in this class. So if I'm the Tennessee Titans, I am taking a cornerback. Then you got the Carolina Panthers. Panthers can go in so many different ways at this point. We traded away from the number one overall pick if the Panthers actually had that because I think Bryce Young is still their quarterback of the future. I know people are going to say, well, how do you bench him and then bring him back? To me, I think it's possible, right? You can essentially let Bryce Young sit for a little while. Maybe he comes back week 8 if Andy Dalton doesn't work out. But if Andy Dalton does work out, then you can essentially go into next season with Andy Dalton as your quarterback. Bryce Young is your number 2. Maybe you let them compete. But you add weapons, right? And I think that's the best thing the Tennessee Titans can do. To me, Tutorial McMillan's one of those guys that's just different. And I know the Panthers have essentially added some pieces, right? They got Xavier Legette this past year. I think he was a first-round wide receiver. Jonathan Mingo was, I think, the 32nd pick in the 2023 NFL draft. Now, he was technically a second-round pick. Remember, the Miami Dolphins lost their first-round pick. So he was technically the first pick in the second round, but he's still a highly drafted player as well. Taking a wide receiver again this high might not make sense, but I'm telling you guys, McMillan's a game changer, right? This guy's way different than any wide receiver that is really dominant in the NFL right now, right? Like 6'4", 6'5", massive, and he's fast, right? He can run routes. McMillan is absolutely different, and I think you put McMillan with the other guys that they already kind of have, and you have a really good wide receiving group that could support a quarterback like Bryce Young, or maybe down the line you get a quarterback in a year or two. I think this quarterback class is also unique, but because there's probably like 8 quarterbacks that you can consider in the first round, which means that some of those quarterbacks will fall, so you could even draft a guy in the second round if you really wanted to. The Commanders also took a quarterback. They got the 6th overall pick. This one's an interesting one as well because the Commanders do have some good weapons on offense. They have some good weapons on defense as well, although I do think they can continue to improve the defensive side of the football. I think the Commanders should consider adding a corner. They could consider adding a wide receiver as well. I think Travis Hunter would make sense for the Commanders because he can essentially play both positions. Now, he's not going to in the NFL. Let's just call it what it is. He does want to, though, right? I seen an article just like 2 or 3 days ago where Travis Hunter said he wants to continue to play both sides of football. And Deion Sanders, Coach Prime, actually thinks that he can. I don't personally think he can. I think the best thing Travis Hunter could do is just play one position or the other. I think he's probably a better wide receiver than he is a corner. And I think the Commanders also have a need at that wide receiver position. So to me, it just kind of makes sense. The Arizona Cardinals are another interesting team. because of the fact that they have a quarterback, they have a great wide receiver in Marvin Harrison, they have a really good tackle in Paris Johnson. But I think on the defensive side of the football, they're kind of missing some pieces, and I think that's one thing that they're going to have to do over the next couple of years. It's really shore up the defensive side of the football. You can go edge, you can go interior, or you can go outside on the corner spot, right? But we're not 100% sure which cornerback. I do think the Notre Dame cornerback Benjamin Morrison is probably cornerback 3, but East Carolina Siobhan Revelle, very, very solid corner as well, but he did tear his ACL at practice. I think there was some news that kind of dropped earlier today, so if you guys don't know what I'm talking about. Siobhan Revelle out of East Carolina. A lot of people had him as cornerback 3 in this class, and unfortunately, that injury, he'll probably won't come out now at this point. Although there's a chance he does, right? We'll see what ends up actually happening. I think he had the potential to be a top 15 pick, right? I really, really do think that. And the cornerback class this year is very, very good as well, right? You get 3 or 4 corners that are going to be legit corners in the NFL. I think the defensive tackle class is not as good, right? We've seen in past years, there's a lot of really good D tackles that came out. 2 years ago, we had like Jalen Carter, we had Clyde Jucansi, Brian Bazet. All those guys ended up being really, really good defensive tackles. This year, I don't think it's as good. And again, I know a lot of people love Mason Graham. I personally have not seen enough from this guy to say he's worthy of a top 10 pick. I do like Mikael Williams a lot. We only saw him like 20 snaps in that very first week 1 game. And he hasn't played since, but Mikael Williams, man, he has all the potential in the world, right? This guy's long. He's a freak athlete. And I think if you're the Arizona Cardinals, you need to have those type of players on your defense, right? You need difference makers. Mikael Williams makes sense to me, right? It's a position of need. It's a position that you want to be able to add in this position where it just kind of makes sense. Then you got the Minnesota Vikings. Now, the Vikings are a very interesting team as well, specifically because I like what the Vikings have done on the defensive side over the past draft or two, right? They obviously went out. They got some good linebackers, right? They got Ivan Pace, who I don't think they actually drafted him, or they might have. Don't quote me on that. But he's a really, really good young linebacker. You had Dallas Turner as well last year. I do think they can continue to improve the interior defensive line. And that's probably what we're going to do for them. We'll probably end up adding an interior guy. But I wouldn't be surprised if the Minnesota Vikings took an offensive lineman as well. They have a great left tackle. They have a really, really good right tackle as well in Brian O'Neill. Although I do think that Brian O'Neill could potentially be replaced, right? If you wanted to save cap dollars, right? Justin Jefferson's getting paid, right? That type of money that you have to start to consider different things. You might also have to consider paying J.J. McCarthy down the line, right? He'll be technically in year 2 next year, but 2 years down the line from that point, you're going to have to pay him a lot of money as well. You got to get cheaper, right? Christian Darrisaw is one of the highest paid tackles. You got to figure all that out, right? As you're the Minnesota Vikings. Dallas Turner is going to get a lot of money. That guy's also very, very, very good. Corner could also make sense for the Vikings here. Interior defensive line also makes sense. And even offensive line, right? Like Will Campbell to me is a good player, but I'm not sure if he's a tackle in the NFL. In fact, Will Campbell's measurables to me say he's not a tackle, right? And we'll talk about that at the point that Will Campbell ultimately ends up getting drafted. So stay tuned for that. If I'm the Minnesota Vikings, man, you just got to give a guy like Brian Flores weapons on that side of the football. And I think the best overall player in this class is actually safety Malachi Starks. And I don't know if I don't know if the Minnesota Vikings really need a guy that's like Malachi Starks. They have some good pieces in the secondary, but Malachi Starks isn't just a safety, right? He plays nickel, he'll play post, he'll play split safety. You can even line him up as a corner, but really he's like Kyle Hamilton, right? Where he's a weapon on the offensive side. And I actually think Malachi Starks is better than Kyle Hamilton. I think Malachi Starks might be the best overall player on the defensive side in this draft. So I'm going to actually give Brian Flores a weapon, right? Through the air on the back end, right? A guy that can pretty much do everything. And then you got the Las Vegas Raiders, man. Let's talk about this one. So the Raiders are in an interesting, very, very interesting position where, in 2 days, we might say, man, Gardner Minshew's so legit. Do the Raiders really need a quarterback? Or we might be saying, damn, the Raiders got to get their quarterback of the future. And if it's the first one, right, where Gardner Minshew looks legit and the Raiders decide, hey, why take a quarterback if you have the 9th overall pick? There's some interesting players that you might want to consider. Zamir White has not looked good, and there's a running back in Ashton Gentry that is game changer that you're considering potentially with this pick. At the same time, there's some wide receivers even past the top three guys. Isaiah Bond, right, former Alabama transfer, phenomenal wide receiver, fast, explosive, quick. Amika Agbua, a very, very solid player as well. Maybe you consider that. Maybe you get yourself a right tackle, right? Kelvin Banks, very solid tackle as well. Although I would definitely consider a right tackle from the Las Vegas Raiders, there's just no way you can't go with the quarterback. All right, if you're the Las Vegas Raiders, you have to take a quarterback at this point. And some people might say, man, there's only been one quarterback drafted in the first 8 picks. That doesn't really seem realistic. Trust me when I say this, man. Although there's good quarterbacks in this class, teams have quarterbacks across the NFL. There's not that many teams that really need quarterbacks, right? Like coming into last year's draft, bro, you had like 6-7 teams that needed quarterbacks. You had 3 or 4 more that could potentially draft quarterbacks, right? Like the Jets, the Raiders, the Saints. All of these teams could have potentially drafted a quarterback as well. The Steelers, the Buccaneers potentially, right? But some of those kind of got answered, right? Derek Carr's playing well. Baker Mayfield's playing well. Justin Fields is playing well. So some of these teams don't need quarterbacks. And I think some quarterbacks are going to end up falling, especially since there's like 7-8 good quarterbacks in this class. I think this could be the best quarterback class in a long time. And if I'm the Las Vegas Raiders, I'm taking a quarterback. There's just no way I'm not, even if Gardner Minshew looks really, really good. And with Carson Beck on the board, that definitely makes sense. Shedeur Sanders makes sense. Quinn Ewers is a guy that I really, really like. But if I'm the Las Vegas Raiders and I'm taking a quarterback, I'm taking Miami quarterback Cam Ward. Cam Ward, to me, is a phenomenal quarterback. And again, these rankings are not right at the end of the day, right? PFF rankings are not right, at least at this point, right? They'll update as we kind of go forward. To me, Miller Moss is the best quarterback in this class. I think Cam Ward's the only other guy that is going to, at the end of the year, be considered that top spot. I think Cam Ward's going to be a very, very good quarterback. And with the Raiders, the thing is you can let him sit for a year. You can let him sit, you can let him learn, and you can let the Raiders continue to develop and continue to add more talent on the offensive side, specifically on the offensive line, right? I think the Raiders are in a really, really good spot where they could actually take a quarterback with the 9th overall pick, let him develop, and going into his second year, he could potentially at that point take over. The Seattle Seahawks, I think, should also consider taking a quarterback. I know some people love Geno Smith. I think he's a good quarterback, but I just don't think Geno Smith can ultimately take you and get you into the championship. I don't think Geno Smith can win you a Super Bowl, right? I just don't see that with him. I think Shedeur Sanders is a very, very good fit for the Seattle Seahawks, specifically because of the fact that he can sit and learn behind Geno Smith, right? Geno Smith is a good quarterback. I don't think he'll take you over the top. And with that, I think Shedeur Sanders can sit for 1 or 2 years, learn, develop, and eventually take over. In fact, I think we're going to see a trend in the NFL over the next, 4 or 5 years where, Bryce Young doesn't happen anymore. Caleb Williams does not happen anymore. Instead, teams are going to draft quarterbacks and they're going to let them sit. And I think it's going to start this upcoming year. And I also think teams aren't going to reach for quarterbacks anymore because teams are going to start to recognize that, at the end of the day, your fit as a quarterback matters a lot more than the actual quarterback himself. Your offensive coordinator, your playmakers, all that stuff matters so much more than the actual quarterback himself. The play caller, to me, is the most important part of this, right? And if your play caller is good, they'll have success with Jimmy G. They'll have success with Geno Smith. It really doesn't matter. If your play caller is good, he'll have success with whoever it is, right? Then you got the New Orleans Saints. I think it's another team that could consider a quarterback. But I don't think the Saints actually will end up taking a quarterback, specifically because when you look at the Saints, they do have Derek Carr, who, Derek Carr doesn't have to be replaced for 4 or 5 years, especially if he continues to play the way he is playing right now. Now, I do personally think Klint Kubiak is an absolute difference maker when you consider offensive coordinators. And I do think Klint Kubiak is going to end up leaving the Saints. If it's not this year, probably by the end of next year. And with that, we'll see how Derek Carr continues to play down the line after that. I think it's pretty clear, when you look at the Saints as an example last year, a lot of Saints fans wanted to replace Derek Carr. Klint Kubiak comes in and out of nowhere, Derek Carr looks like an absolute superstar, right? So I think that just kind of proves the point that your play caller matters a ton. I think the New Orleans Saints should focus in on their offensive line, and I know some people aren't going to disagree with this. I still think the Saints' offensive line isn't that good, specifically with Trevor Penning. Penning is having success with the right tackle position right now, but one of the things that I think the Saints have to do is they got to shore up that offensive line. And Penning, I think, would be a much better guard, and I think we'll find that out as like the Saints continue to play these games as it kind of goes forward. And that too, when the Saints get down and they got a 5-man pass pro and maybe it's 3rd and long, they're gonna start to see those leaks a little bit with those offensive linemen, specifically with Trevor Penning. So to me, I'm taking an offensive tackle now. Some people are going to consider Will Campbell as the number 1 tackle. I think it's Kelvin Banks. In fact, I don't think Will Campbell gets drafted as a tackle. As a scout for the Hula Bowl, I have access to advanced measured data, right? That's official numbers, right? Officially measured numbers. And Will Campbell's arm length is too short. So he's not going to end up being drafted as high as some people think because he's not going to be valued as a tackle at the next level. So I think Will Campbell is going to end up falling. Now, I do think he'll be a 1st-round pick, and I do think he'll be the best offensive lineman in this class, but I think that'll be at guard. I just don't think it makes sense. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers can definitely go a bunch of different ways. They're a team that could potentially take a quarterback as well, but the Buccaneers, I think, should focus in on the defense. If there's a linebacker that's very, very good, a difference-making linebacker, you can consider that. I don't think that exists in this class specifically. You could go defensive end, which I think could make sense here as well. There's definitely some good football players. Jack Sawyer, JT Tomilo, those are 2 guys that I personally really, really like. Abdul Carter is a guy that has a tremendous upside as well. You can definitely consider that, but I think cornerback makes sense for the Buccaneers as well. Benjamin Morrison, I think, is probably the 3rd best corner in this class. I'm taking that from the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. The Indianapolis Colts could go offensive line. I do think they have a pretty good offensive line, and I think the scheme and system works for the way they kind of do things, right? They run the football a lot, and everything's based out of play action, but maybe they add some weapons on the defensive side, right? Maybe you go defensive tackle. Mason Graham could be a good pick here. And in fact, I'm going to just go ahead and pull the trigger. The Colts do have DeForest Buckner, who's a really, really good interior defensive tackle. I think they got to look forward to potentially replacing him down the line. So to me, I think that just kind of makes sense. Plus, Mason Graham can sit back and learn, right? He'll play, obviously. He'll be probably a day 1 starter. But it also allows him to kind of learn from Buckner and take from his game. There's just no way the Pittsburgh Steelers don't take a quarterback. I like Justin Fields. Russell Wilson's okay. But Justin Fields, I just don't think long-term is going to be the future for the Pittsburgh Steelers. To me, the Steelers are going to end up taking a quarterback. Now, it'll be interesting which quarterback they end up going with because I do think Jalen Milroy is a guy that has tremendous upside. He has a lot of potential as well. But I think Carson Beck at this point also kind of makes sense. I think Beck was a little overrated coming into the season. I think in that first game he struggled. Week 2 he struggled early on, but he got better and better as the game kind of went on. And we'll see how he kind of plays the rest of the year. It's going to be a year in which he's going to have to really prove it. The Rams, 15th overall pick. The Rams always make the weirdest picks, so why not? Let's take the best offensive player, potentially, in this entire class, in Ashton Jeanty out of Boise State. This is a guy whose stock has absolutely went crazy after he had a crazy game against Oregon. I think it was Oregon that he dominated, right? I think he had over 200 yards. Don't quote me on any of that. But he had a really, really good game. I think he's going to be a phenomenal player. And I think with the Rams, they do have a good, running back. They took Blake Corum, I think, in the 4th round last year. But Ashton Jeanty's different, right? He changes your offense. The Rams could also be in the market for a quarterback. But honestly, I just don't think that makes sense. Sean McVay is a great offensive coordinator. I think he could have just as much success with, a different quarterback. Maybe you trade for a guy. Maybe you get a free agent guy. There's quarterbacks that are available in the NFL as well that maybe other teams have as their backups. And I just don't see Sean McVay saying, hey, let's get a rookie quarterback with the 15th overall pick when you have that type of player in Jeanty. Remember, he tried trading up for Brock Bowers, right? So I think he's going to go and see Jeanty one time in person and say, that's the guy we need, right? The Jacksonville Jaguars, another interesting team. They have a pretty good offensive line. They have a pretty good defensive line. They got 2 good defensive ends. Although some people don't think Trayvon Walker's that good. They could go corner at this point. That could make sense for them. They could go wide receiver. Shoot, they could probably go quarterback, to be honest, because some people don't think Trevor Lawrence is the guy, you know. I'm gonna actually go with offensive line. I'm gonna give the Jacksonville Jaguars the best offensive lineman in this class. The Jags are a good football team, right, across the board. Now, they could go wide receiver here. I could see that making sense, but they did take Brian Thomas last year. Running back wouldn't make sense either. They could go corner, but, you know, if the top 3 corners are off the board, you take a corner with a 16th. Maybe that's a little bit of a reach at this point. I'm going to have the Jacksonville Jaguars take Will Campbell, guard, not tackle, guard. I think it just makes sense for them. Then you got the Cleveland Browns. Browns have a great defensive line. They have a good secondary. They have a great defense, generally speaking. I think the Cleveland Browns go ahead and go forward with the quarterback. You know, I think the Cleveland Browns made a huge mistake with Deshaun Watson. I think everybody sees that. You know what? People don't think about it, but Deshaun Watson was a product of the scheme, right? That he was essentially in with the Houston Texans. He looked great with the Texans for like 2-3 years, and it was just it's essentially a great offensive situation, right? And with the Cleveland Browns, they've just never been able to replicate that. And to me, it just makes you recognize that, you know, quarterback play is sometimes a little overrated, right? Sometimes what's around you is what's going to allow you to have success more so than the actual guy himself. Now, with Deshaun Watson, it's different. I just think he kind of sucks as a quarterback. Let's take Quinn Ewers. Quinn Ewers may actually end up getting benched, although I don't think that's going to happen. I think Quinn Ewers gives Texas a better chance to win the national championship this year than does Arch Manning. I know some people don't disagree with me on that. Arch Manning might be a better overall quarterback in the future, but experience matters as a quarterback in college. And Quinn Ewers, I think, will end up having a very, very good year. And I think in the college football playoffs, Texas is going to be a hard team to stop, man. That offensive line's really, really good. Speaking about offensive line, Chicago Bears are on the clock. And maybe they take an offensive lineman here. Would offensive tackle make sense for the Chicago Bears? I think it could make sense here, right? The Bears have a good defense. They don't need wide receivers. Maybe a running back. I mean, if Ashton Genty's here, potentially, but I think they should take an offensive tackle. And I think they should take the best offensive tackle, or one of the best, in my opinion, is going to be Josh Connerly Jr. out of Oregon. Some people might not agree with this, but I think Ryan Poles will agree with me on this one. To me, I don't think Will Campbell is a true tackle. I think Kelvin Banks is. And I think Josh Connerly Jr. definitely is as well. So with that, I think the Chicago Bears end up taking tackle Josh Connerly Jr. out of Oregon. I think this guy's a phenomenal tackle, man. If you guys watch this guy move, he does a really, really good job. And I think for a team like the Chicago Bears, who, you know, I don't think their offensive line is bad, but I'm not sure Braxton Jones is the future offensive lineman or the future of the Chicago Bears, right? So again, I think it just makes a ton of sense. The Chargers got a quarterback, you got a coach, you're running the football, you're being aggressive. Defense could definitely need some work. Maybe you target a cornerback at this point. Safety could make sense, right? If a guy like Malachi Starks is here, you're considering that. If you're the Chargers, Kevin Winston Jr. is another guy out of Penn State that I really, really like. But I could also see the Chargers potentially taking a wide receiver. I think the Chargers could add speed on that side of the football. They have Quentin Johnson, who really hasn't worked out up to this point. They took Ladd McConkey last year in the second round. He looks pretty good, right? Although it's not anything crazy. He looks good, right? He's one of those guys that can definitely make plays. But I think the big thing that Coach Harbaugh is going to end up adding is going to be speed. Agbuka looks definitely like one of those guys you could potentially add here. Although, you know, Ohio State wide receivers don't look as good this year as they have in the past years. And I think Isaiah Bond's going to end up having an incredible finish to this season. I think Bond could be a really good fit with the Chargers, right? They got a tall wide receiver in Quentin Johnston. They have a possession wide receiver in McConkey. And I think Isaiah Bond just kind of goes naturally with that. Right? He's like that speed guy ultimately for the Chargers. I think that's a great fit right there. The Houston Texans, great defensive line. Arguably one of the best defensive lines in the NFL. Defensive side of the football, they're pretty solid. I could see them taking a corner. Maybe an interior defensive tackle could make sense for the Houston Texans as well. Deion Walker out of Kentucky, I think, is a really, really good fit. Walker's one of those guys that's kind of different, right? He's big, he's strong. But the big difference with him and someone like Jordan Davis, who came out a couple years ago, is Walker is actually a better pass rusher. To me, that could be a really, really solid fit. The Texans could also end up focusing on the offensive line. They could get a running back, right? I think that would be an interesting pick here as well for the Houston Texans. But the Texans have kind of proven you can bring in a bunch of different running backs and have success. But I do think the Texans are going to have to figure something out because Bobby Slowick's going to leave after this year, right? Bobby Slowick's going to end up leaving, and then they'll have to hire another offensive coordinator to potentially, continue that trend where CJ Stroud's able to continue to have success. They could go with the safety as well, or a corner, right? Takario Davis, another guy out of Arizona that I really, really like. They could go with a third pass rusher as well. You got Danielle Hunter on one side. You got a Will Anderson on the other. You could get a third guy in there, right? A guy that can kind of long-term develop behind those guys and eventually take over for Hunter. I'm going to actually go ahead and stick to an offensive lineman. I think it's going to make the most sense for the Houston Texans. They have a great left tackle in Laramie Tunsil. They have some good interior guys. I think they should go ahead and add a right tackle that they can 100% count on. Now, they did take an offensive tackle in last year's class. I'm not 100% sure if he's the future for the Texans, to be honest with you guys. I think the Texans should continue to add players to that offense. You don't need wide receivers at this point, right? Or running backs. You could consider a defensive guy as well, but I also think that when you're a team like the Houston Texans, protecting CJ Stroud should always be the number one. It should always be the number one priority, right? The Kansas City Chiefs do it with Patrick Mahomes, where they are continuously replacing those offensive linemen because you can't pay everyone, right? We all know that to be a fact. I like Emory Jones. He's a natural right tackle as well. Of LSU, I think he's going to end up going a lot higher than people realize. I'm going to take Ariante Ursary. I think Ursary ends up being a really, really good NFL player. And I think the Texans are a lot more, they're a team that wants to be physical, right? They're a team that has some good offensive linemen that are bigger and stronger. And I think Ursary's one of those guys that can definitely fit in, right? He's long, he's big, he's strong. And it just kind of lets the Texans be what the Texans are, right? You got a big, strong left tackle. You got a big, strong left guard and right guard. I think it just makes sense. The Texans end up taking an offensive tackle. The Jets could go in a lot of different directions. You can go wide receiver to add some more weapons on the offensive side. You can go quarterback, right? A guy that can develop on, behind Aaron Rodgers. I think, honestly, quarterback makes the most sense for the Jets, but if the Jets end up falling short of winning a Super Bowl, you got like 1 or 2 years left with Aaron Rodgers. You might actually want to go all in on that side of the football. And I don't think the Jets need offensive linemen. Maybe they get a defensive end. Jermaine Johnson did end up getting hurt. He's out for the year. He might not even be, 100% come the start of the season. Maybe if you're the Jets, you get a D tackle to pair up with Quinn and Williams. You can go in a ton of different directions, right? If you're the New York Jets. I think tight end can be another position where the Jets could potentially go, right? I think they have some issues at that position. In fact, let's just go with the tight end. Let's go with the best tight end in this class, Colston Loveland out of Michigan. Loveland's a very, very good tight end, man. This guy's a difference maker at the tight end position. He is easily Michigan's best overall offensive player this year, right? I think as we continue to go further along, people are going to recognize that more and more. I think Carter Warren, the quarterback of Michigan, is kind of a bad quarterback. And I think as a tight end, not having a good quarterback does impact you statistically a little bit. But they also did make the change at quarterback going into this next week, right? So they'll have a new quarterback going in Orgy. He'll end up starting. I think Loveland's stats might actually be a little bit higher, although he might not end up playing this week either because he is hurt against USC. Massive game coming up. To me, Jets take a tight end. I think it helps the entire team overall. You got the Atlanta Falcons, another very, very solid football club. Great defense, maybe a little underperforming at the moment. They took a quarterback last year. They have some good weapons, have a good tight end. They have a good wide receiver. You could potentially go interior offensive line. If there's a center in this class and the Falcons feel like, hey, we might need to replace Drew Dalman. Although I do think he's a good center, if they do feel like, hey, we might need to replace him, or I like Matthew Bergeron, really like Chris Lindstrom. Maybe you want to look to potentially replace Chris Lindstrom down the line. You never know. Probably won't do that, but maybe they go tackle, right? Maybe you go tackle. The interesting thing with the Atlanta Falcons is Dwayne Ledford, right? The way he kind of drafts his offensive linemen, he drafts guys with a very, very low BMI. So either, essentially guys that might not weigh a lot, right? They got to be super fast, super quick, super explosive. But sometimes those guys do get pushed back a little bit, right? There is actually one guy that I really, really like. Now, they're not going to take an offensive lineman, but I'll go ahead and just tell you guys anyway, since we're kind of breaking this draft down a little bit. Luke Kandra out of Cincinnati is, in my opinion, going to be a superstar guard at the next level. But I think that's specifically going to be for zone-heavy schemes. So Atlanta Falcons would make a lot of sense. The San Francisco 49ers would make a lot of sense. Although the 49ers do have 2 guards now, so that wouldn't make sense for them. The Packers could be another team, right? Mike McDaniel and the Miami Dolphins may be in need of a guard. For this scheme specifically, offensive lineman probably doesn't make the most sense for the Atlanta Falcons. You could go defensive end, although they do have some good defensive guys. Right? They got Matthew Judon. They got a really good D tackle. They also took Arnold Ebiketie, who hasn't really broken out yet. Maybe you take the best overall defensive player available on the board at this point. I think at this point it'll probably be Abdul Carter. Carter, some people do think, hasn't, taken that step to becoming a really, really good defensive player. I think it does kind of fit what the Falcons do based off of the defensive side. They don't really care about guys that are, super big and they fit a certain type of stereotype. They took Ebiketie, who was long, lengthy, fast, explosive, maybe not as strong. Although he's developed, I think he's like in year 3 as well at this point. I think the Falcons should take an interior defensive lineman. I'm going to actually give them Deion Walker. The Falcons already have Grady Garrett, who's a really, really, really good defensive tackle. I think it makes sense for them to take another interior defense lineman, right? They got to start replacing some of those guys. The Falcons don't have a lot of needs, right? Maybe they go wide receiver. I think that's probably the only position you can consider. It's not even a need really, but it's just at this point, the rich get richer essentially. The Falcons, I think, could take a defensive tackle. Deion Walker, I think, makes the most sense. Again, similar to Jordan Davis, but with pass rush technique, right? So I think it's a great fit for them. Got the Miami Dolphins. I might even, if there was a way to just sort this by who's the fastest team or who's the fastest 40-yard dash, I'd just take the guy at the number 1 spot because it's probably what the Miami Dolphins are going to end up doing. The Dolphins don't need a whole lot, man, but this one's not going to make sense to a lot of people, I think, but I'm going to just do it, man. I think the Miami Dolphins got to get another quarterback. I think Tua's an okay quarterback, and I know you just paid him all this money, but there are ways to get out of that contract with the injury. Right? And I know Tua's going to come back and he's going to want to continue to play. But if you're Mike McDaniel, you can't continue going down this line where you're invested in Tua Tagovailoa to have success and the guy's consistently getting hurt. You can't do that if you're Mike McDaniel because you're going to get fired in 2 years if Tua Tagovailoa is always getting hurt. Right? He's always missing games. He's always getting hurt. He takes one big hit and bam, he has a concussion. To me, I think Mike McDaniel is the type of coach where he can make any quarterback work. But the better the quarterback is, right, the more athletic he is, the better processor and decision maker, the better a quarterback is that this guy can work with. Because I do think Tua Tagovailoa is one of the bottom 5 starting quarterbacks in the NFL. I don't think he's a good quarterback. I think Mike McDaniel makes him a lot better. And McDaniel can do what he does with Tua with so many other quarterbacks. And I think you give him a talent like Jalen Milroe. Garrett Nussmeier is another guy out of LSU who's looked a lot better these past week and a half. Connor Wigman out of Texas A&M is another guy that could potentially rise down the. His stock could definitely rise, as could Jackson Dart, but I don't know if those guys are going to end up being first-round picks. Drew Aller out of Penn State is a guy that could potentially be a first-round pick. There's some interesting players, right? But I think Jalen Milroe is going to end up being one of the 4 or 5 quarterbacks that's going to end up going in the first round. And I think this is also the year where if you're a team that is in the playoffs, you're going to get good quarterbacks to drop to you because every team has a quarterback at this point. And the Miami Dolphins are never going to have an opportunity going forward to get a quarterback that they will this year because of how the NFL kind of is. Milroy makes a lot of sense to me. I'm going to pull the trigger here for the Dolphins. Now, if they don't take a quarterback, right, they can go offensive line if they wanted to, although they got Patrick Paul last year, who looks pretty good. You could get a guard, but there's a lot of guards. Probably get one in the second, third round as well. Quarterback, maybe you go defensive end potentially, but maybe you go corner, right? That's another thing the Dolphins could potentially do, but I'm going to take a quarterback from the Miami Dolphins. I think it makes sense for them at this point. The Green Bay Packers, you can go so many different ways. Very, very good team. You know, on the offensive side, they're stacked, right? Like, what do the Packers really need at this point? You could go on the defensive side, right? I think the Packers have one of the best defensive lines. I probably wouldn't go defensive line. They've taken some linebackers in the top 2 rounds over the last, I think, 3 years. They've taken 2 guys, right? They took Quinn Walker 2 years ago. This past year, they took Edgerrin Cooper. They could go corner. I think corner probably makes the most sense for them. Now, I don't know if Revel out of East Carolina is going to come out. Burke's another guy that I think is going to end up going higher than what people realize. But you can't go wrong with Tacario Davis either. It's going to probably be between one of these 3 guys. I do think Revel has the most upside, but he does have the injury, right? So we're not 100% sure if at this point he'll even be a first-round corner. I'm going to take Denzel Burke. I think Denzel Burke, you know, Ohio State, I think he has a lot of upside, and I think as more tape keeps coming out, this guy, I think people will start to recognize where he kind of ranks. The Packers are a great football roster, man. If Matt LaFleur is able to put it together with that team, they're going to be one of the best teams pretty much for the next, 10 years, right? It's just a matter of replacing talent. The Dallas Cowboys gave Dak Prescott a 4-year contract, and it's 4 years starting next year, so 5 more years with Dak Prescott. I think that was a terrible decision by the Dallas Cowboys. I understand it, right? I get it. You know, Dak Prescott counted so much against the cap, and then you have a lot of dead cap as well. It just doesn't make sense to me, man. You can't win with those type of core. You can't win Super Bowls with Dak Prescott. You can't win Super Bowls with Geno Smith, right? Those aren't Super Bowl caliber quarterbacks. Now, you might get lucky 1 year. Nick Foles got lucky 1 year. He won, right? You could get lucky in 1 year and you might end up winning with Dak Prescott. But the Cowboys are a downward team at this point, in my opinion, specifically because of the fact that all your guys are about to get paid. Tyler Smith's going to get paid. Dak Prescott has got paid. CeeDee Lamb's gotten paid. Michael Parsons coming up. Tyler Smith obviously will end up getting paid. Cooper Beebe, I know it's 3 years down the line, but he's going to end up getting paid. Oso Digizua, right? Trayvon Diggs is paid. You got to consider paying the other corner as well. It's just hard, man. You can't pay everyone, right? Deron Bland make a top 5 to 7 cornerback salary as well. So, I think quarterback this year would have been a great thing for the Dallas Cowboys to get. And they might still even end up taking a quarterback. But at this point, I'm just not 100% sure what the Cowboys will end up doing. You could take a safety after what Derek Carr did to them. I think that might make some sense. Honestly, I do think the Cowboys should continue to improve the defensive side of the football, right? They got some good linebackers in Maris Leofau, DeMarvin Overshown, but those guys got to develop. You have Michael Parsons. Mozzie Smith doesn't really look too good right now, but I think he'll continue to improve. Him and Osa together will continue to improve. They took Marshawn Nealon last year in the draft as well in the second round. I think safety makes sense. You could go another corner, but I mean, you already got 2 really, really good corners. Although Bland is hurt right now. You could add a wide receiver. And honestly, if you don't go safety, wide receiver makes a lot of sense as well. Maybe running back, depending on which running back, is kind of available. Quinshon Judkins is ranked really, really high, which is kind of interesting. There's some good running backs coming out this year out of the draft. And the Cowboys should have probably taken a running back last year. They obviously did not. It's going to be interesting. A receiver to keep an eye on is Torrey Horton out of Colorado State. I think Horton's stock's going to continue to improve. It's unfortunate because, without a quarterback in college, guys struggle, right? They really, really do struggle. But I can definitely see the Dallas Cowboys taking a wide receiver. I think Ibuka makes the most sense at this point because of the fact that he's a number 2 wide receiver, and I think he goes really well opposite of CeeDee Lamb. And if you're the Cowboys and you want to win, you're gonna have to score points to win, right? And you have a good pass defense, but the offense has to score points. And I think with CeeDee Lamb, that's great, but you got to continue to add more talent, right? And again, they got to get a running back, right? But I don't think at this pick it makes sense. So the Philadelphia Eagles, another team, might be in the market for a quarterback. You never know, man. Jalen Hurts has not looked all that good over the past year or so. They could go wide receiver, although they do have two good wide receivers. But, one of the things that great teams do is they stack up wide receivers, right? They don't only have two. They'll have like 3 or 4 wide receivers or playmakers, generally speaking. You could go offensive line as well if you're the Philadelphia Eagles. If you're not 100% sold on Cam Jurgens, Jonah Monheim out of USC, best center in this class. He's a guy you can consider. If Mekhi Becton is not the future at right guard, maybe take Tate Ratledge, although you do have Tyler Steen as well. That probably doesn't make sense. I do think edge defender is a position the Cowboys could consider at this point. And I'm going to go ahead and just pull the trigger on a defensive end. I like Abdul Carter a lot, and I think for the Philadelphia Eagles, that could make sense. I also like Jack Sawyer, and I think Sawyer is going to end up climbing the draft boards. I think he's going to end up becoming one of the, I think he's going to end up becoming one of the top 20 picks. So if he's there at this point, I think it makes sense for the Eagles. The Detroit Lions, another team where you don't need a whole lot for the Detroit Lions. You could add another wide receiver. You could add a corner. You could add a safety, an interior defense tackle, but you don't really need any of those positions. You could even go quarterback if you're the Detroit Lions. Now, they did draft a quarterback, I think, like 2 or 3 years ago. Probably won't go quarterback. Let's go with the safety for the Detroit Lions. We'll take Kevin Winston Jr. Winston, very, very good football player as well. Not exactly in the same category as Malachi Starks, but he's a really good safety as well. He'll come downhill. He'll hit you as well. He's a good football player, right? Definitely one of those guys that you want on your football team. The Cincinnati Bengals, let's give them a defensive end. You got the Buffalo Bills. Let's give them an interior defensive lineman, although I do think the Bills have a really good roster. I do think the Bills could potentially continue to add wide receivers. Let's actually look at the wide receivers really quickly. I do like some of these guys up here. Again, I think Torrey Horton's going to end up going a lot higher than what people realize. Horton's one of those guys that has upside for sure, right? I do think that, this year might be a little bit harder for him statistically to have the season he had last year. 96 catches, 1,144 yards, 8 touchdowns. He's probably not going to have that type of season this year. He could end up falling as well because of it. Maybe you don't go wide receiver. Maybe you take an offensive lineman, although they have put a lot of investments in on the offensive line as well. You could take a guy like Emory Jones who can play both tackle and guard. Maybe you do take an offensive tackle. Maybe you take a guy like Emory Jones who, maybe early on he plays guard and he transitions back over to the tackle spot. All right, I think the Bills do have to replace their left tackle in Deion Dawkins. Let's take Emory Jones. Let's just go ahead and do it. I think it's a good fit for them. The Baltimore Ravens, what do the Ravens really need, right? What do they really need? They have, receivers, they have running backs, they have tight ends, they have maybe an offensive lineman, although Roger Rosengarten should develop, and I think they spent a second-round pick on him, so you probably wait for him to develop. You could go defensive end. I think that definitely makes sense for the Ravens. Nick Scorton could make sense. I do like him. I'm just not 100% sold on him, right? He reminds me way too much of a guy that just doesn't have a super explosive first step. He doesn't have great pass rush technique. I do like a guy like JT Tamaloa out of Ohio State. Landon Jackson's a guy that I think is going to continue to climb the draft boards as well. I think it's a good fit for them. The 49ers, I think, could go so many different ways. I think one of the things the Niners have to continue to do is just continue to build on the defensive side of the football. Nick Scorton can make sense, but I think they should take an interior guy. I think Kenneth Grant is going to end up being probably the second or third defensive tackle taken. I'm going to go ahead and pull the trigger there. Finally, you got the Chiefs, who are predicted to win a Super Bowl. Maybe the Chiefs add a running back. Right? The Chiefs always take playmakers at the end of the first round. They have a good offensive line. They have a good defense. You could go defensive line for the Chiefs. I've been hearing a lot of really, really bad things about their defensive ends. You could go Scorton if you're the Chiefs. JT Tamaloa is a guy that I really, really like. The Mississippi defense, man, I haven't even really watched this guy's tape. I didn't know this guy was ranked that high. He hasn't really been on my draft board. Patrick Payton's a guy that you can potentially take, although his stock has absolutely went down after week 1, where Florida State got their ass kicked. Jalen Walker has a little bit of twitch to his tape. You could go interior defensive lineman, right? You can get a guy to potentially go with Chris Jones. Bear Alexander's a guy to keep an eye on. I think he could end up being one of the best D tackles if he were to come out this year. He is a backup, unfortunately. I don't know why USC is doing this, but he's not a backup. He's their rotational guy, right? They got 4 defense tackles that all play about 50% of snaps. And he's essentially one of the guys that comes in second. Now, Bear Alexander, if you guys don't know, actually came out Jalen Carter's final year at Georgia. Bear Alexander was a starting D tackle next to Jalen Carter. And he was one of the reasons why they won the national championship. He was a very, very good football player that first year at Georgia, his true freshman year. Then he transferred to USC last year, had a pretty good year. This year, for some reason, he's not starting. Now, I'm not sure if there's something else going on. I'm not sure if there's like a character thing with this guy. But he's a guy to kind of keep an eye on. Now, he is a true junior, so he might not actually come out. He has to technically graduate in order to be eligible. The Kansas City Chiefs, let's just give them a running back, man. We shouldn't have to spend this much time on the Kansas City Chiefs pick, right? So there's probably one other running back that could go in the first round, and I'm not sure if Judkins is the guy. Some people love Ole Gordon, although he really hasn't looked that good this year so far. Trevor Etienne's a guy that I think could end up climbing. Running back probably doesn't make sense. Let's give them a corner, man. Let's go ahead and give them Revel, who tore his ACL today. I think he's one of the best corners in this class. He did end up getting hurt, which does suck. But I do think he'll end up bouncing back. There you guys have it, man. There's my official draft right there. You guys can see it. Let me know what you guys think, man. Are there any players that you guys think I should be watching, I should be adding to my board? Guys that I might not be too high on, or maybe I'm too high on, that aren't as good? Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Do you guys agree with me that quarterbacks this year are not going to be treated the way they were in the past drafts? And even going forward, right? Bryce Young, teams might draft quarterbacks just to keep him on the bench for a year or two. We're already seeing it with the Falcons. The Lions did it, right? Well, with the quarterback they took a couple years ago in the second round. He still hasn't played. The Packers have done it for years at this point, right? With both Aaron Rodgers and Jordan Love, and it's worked for them. What do you guys think, man? You guys think teams will actually take that approach? Let me know in the comments below. Thumbs up, subscribe, and I will see you guys next time with another video.